Good evening and a very warm welcome on behalf of the British-German Association to this event on Germany's new government and in an era of global challenges. My name is Tamara Aberle and I'm the Program and Membership Lead here at the BGA. Before we begin, just a very quick note on technology. So at the bottom of your screen, you find the Q&A section where you can post questions during the event and also upvote questions of other attendees. And you can post them at any time during the event. If you are joining us today for the first time and you would like to become a BGA member, you can do so with very few clicks on our website, britishgermanassociation.org. And now, without further ado, I am introducing very briefly our moderator, Louise Davidson-Schmich. She is Professor of Political Science at the University of Miami, and her research interests include gender and politics, as well as politics in long-term democracies. And now over to you, Louise, to introduce our other speakers and have a great discussion.
Super, thank you very much. Thanks very much to the British-German Association for having us tonight, and to Tamara Aberle for doing all of the logistics and the behind-the-scenes stuff that you don't always see. This is, I think, the perfect day to talk about Germany's new government in an era of global challenges, since we got confirmation this morning that there actually is going to be a new government, and we know a little bit what it looks like and what it purports to stand for. So I'm really happy to be here today talking about these super recent developments with two highly qualified and really interesting speakers. We have with us to my top left on the Zoom screen, Dr. Matthias Dilling. He's an assistant professor of political science at Trinity College in Dublin. He holds a PhD from Oxford, and he's the author of the recently released book, Parties Under Pressure, The Politics of Factions and Party Adaptation, and that came out at the very highly renowned University of Chicago Press, so congratulations to Matthias. And his work has been published in a number of different other outlets, including the British Journal of Political Science. And Matthias's focus in his remarks today is going to be looking at the internal aspect, the domestic aspect of the recently formed coalition. And our second speaker today is Dr. Nicolai von Ondarza. He holds a PhD in political science at the University of Nuremberg-Erlangen. And he's the head of the research division at the Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik, the German Institute for International and Security Affairs. He also is an associate fellow in the Chatham House Europe program, and he's an expert on Germany's role in Europe and German EU-UK relations. So what I think we'll do tonight is I'm going to introduce very briefly some of the background, how we got where we are here today, and just fill you in on some super recent events if you haven't been following them. Then we'll have Matthias talk about the domestic aspects, Nicolai talk about the more international aspects. Then I'll use my chair's prerogative to ask us some questions that we might want to discuss. And then we'll throw it open to audience questions. And again, like Tamara said, you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to enter those questions. So I'm going to go back a little bit to the fall of 2021. In the fall of 2021, Germany had a regularly scheduled election that returned its first three-party coalition to government. That was a coalition among the Social Democrats, the Green Party, and the Free Democratic Party. This coalition had a lot in common on sort of progressive social affairs, but it really had some real different opinions regarding public spending and investment and anything basically that was going to cost money. They were able to form a coalition in part by using some creative accounting, which was then ultimately overturned by the German Supreme Court, which made them be a little bit more realistic in what they were spending. And then they were almost immediately confronted by Vladimir Putin's unilateral invasion of the Ukraine, which also placed a lot of military spending demands or concerns on Germany. So this coalition tried to make it through its 4-year remit. However, it failed in the fall of 2024 when the Free Democrats withdrew from the coalition. And so unusually for Germany, but not unprecedentedly for Germany, snap elections or early elections were held on February 23rd of this year. It featured a campaign that I think by German standards wasn't necessarily particularly interesting or notable, other than attempts by Elon Musk and JD Vance to perhaps shape some of the Germans' voting behavior, which seemed to have little or no effect. And so when the election was held on February 23rd, the election results basically mirrored the polling numbers for the past year or so in Germany. It was definitely a swing to the right, away from this three-party coalition. The largest party in the wake of the election was the Christian Democratic Union, the CDU-CSU. The far-right Alternative for Germany almost doubled its vote share to 20%. It was definitely its best ever result. The SPD and the Green Party were returned to the Bundestag. The Free Democratic Party, however, was not. It didn't pass the 5% threshold. Neither did the Sarah Wagenknecht Party, which was a far-left populist party. And then the only other party in the Bundestag was then the far-left Party, which had a surprising degree of success. So when the election was held and the votes were counted, it became clear that there was really only one likely coalition that could have been formed prior to the election. The Christian Democrats ruled out forming a coalition with the Alternative for Germany, so that mathematical possibility was ruled out. Mathematically, it could have been possible for the Christian Democrats, the Greens, and the far left to form a coalition, but there was basically 0 points of any sort of agreement on that front, which left the CDU-SPD coalition. This is the coalition. Angela Merkel was Chancellor for Germany for 16 years. 12 of her 16 years were exactly this red-black or this grand coalition that was renegotiated in the wake of this election. It took 2.5 months, but a coalition agreement was reached. It was roughly the same length as the coalition agreement that the two parties had formed in the 2017 election. This coalition was put to a vote by members of the Christian Democratic Party who approved it, and put to a referendum by SPD members who just this morning announced that they had approved it. So the coalition looks like it is going to be approved. There's a vote of investiture scheduled for next Tuesday. So we assume, if everything goes as predicted, we'll see a new government in Germany in place next Tuesday. The cabinet portfolio allocations have been divided among the parties, but as far as I know, not every single cabinet member has yet been determined. But I'm sure that Matthias knows a lot more about this. So I'm going to turn the microphone over to Matthias. And Matthias, I'd love to hear what you think is happening domestically in Germany. What are we going to see going forward?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Louise. I hope I won't disappoint. And also thank you so much to Tamara for organizing the panel, and indeed for having me. As Louise has said, it's in the division of labor that we agreed on together with Louise and Nicolai. It comes to me to kind of talk a little bit about kind of the challenges from a domestic perspective, right? So kind of the domestic challenges that the new government is likely to have to deal with. And because we always, kind of, it's always good to have an alliteration, right? Kind of always good to have kind of things starting with the same letter. So I want to talk about like three I think big challenges that are kind of very clearly kind of awaiting the government, the new coalition, and they are revive, respond, and remember. So the first point is that, of course, it's very clear that the new government will face the challenge to revive the economy. It's widely acknowledged that there is a clear need for investment into public infrastructure. There is a clear need to reduce red tape, and there's a clear need to facilitate economic growth. When we look at what we kind of the signs that we've seen so far, both in terms of the specific actions taken, but also the content of the coalition agreement, in this regard, it's likely we kind of seen a bit of a mixed picture, if you like, right? On the one hand, there has been already some promising and decisive action, including the special fund of 500 billion euros that was approved in the special sessions for infrastructure spending. There were also has been, as Louise mentioned, actually fairly kind of, given the starting points, a fairly speedy negotiation, a fairly speedy completion of the coalition agreement, something that was not necessarily widely anticipated given the heat and at times rather toxic campaign in previous 4 years between the parties involved. And there are also, like, to some extent, some elements that might be seen in the coalition agreement that might be seen as promising with regard to the aim of reviving the economy, including the new Ministry of Digital Affairs, or the Digitalministerium, as we would say in German, the clear overarching goal of facilitating economic growth, kind of promises or plans to reduce energy prices and tax burden for businesses. But also the plan is to reduce red tape by, for instance, replacing Germany's infamous supply chain law with its various reporting obligations. On the other hand, it may not quite be the program for the promised political turnaround, or Politikwende, as Merz previously called it, because some of those promised changes, especially around tax cuts, are planned to be introduced only quite gradually and with some delays. They're also subject to budget availability, and while there are some concrete goals of making savings in the federal administration, it remains questionable, whether all of the plans will actually be implemented. But also has been criticized that the coalition agreement actually does not propose any substantive pension reform, which has been widely called for by, for instance, the German Council of Economic Experts, given Germany's demographic development. And so overall, it's a mixed picture with regard to the onset of reviving the economy, and of course the uncertainty surrounding the tariffs imposed by the Trump administration don't help in this regard. The second R is, first R, revive. Second R is respond. And clearly here we need to talk about migration-related grievances. Doing nothing very clearly is not an option. It's very clear that this is a concern of many people in Germany. Has often been linked to AfD success. And while it is, and I want to be very clear on this, it's very questionable whether the only option is to move toward more far-right positions. In fact, I would argue it is not. It is clear that the new government will need to respond to the high saliency around migration. It's become very clear that that there has been there will be a right-wing turn, although it's also very important to highlight that Merz's tough talk during the election campaign has not only been not a vote winner, but also has met basically the realities of coalition politics, but also legal perspectives. And so here the coalition agreement can be seen as more or less of a compromise between two very different perspectives, but still representing a turn toward the radical right. Including plans to abolish the option for accelerated naturalization that the last government had introduced, pausing, aspects of family reunification, reducing legal protection for asylum seekers, extending the list of offenses that may result in a deportation, but also shifting the authority to enforce some of these decisions actually from the state to the federal level. Other plans, like returns to Afghanistan and Syria, for instance, unclear whether they will actually see the light of day, or whether they will actually be implemented. And this actually connects to some of the legal challenges that some of the plans expressed in the coalition agreement are likely to face. For instance, the new coalition wants to extend the list of safe countries of origin. But here it's already been very clear that the European Court of Justice could complicate these plans. The new coalition wants to continue the border controls the last government introduced in September 24, but still also very problematic because Germany signed the Schengen Border Code, which rules out any permanent border checks between Schengen countries. It's also there are already emerging conflicts around other plans, such as the plan to refuse entry at the border to asylum seekers, even if, based on agreements with neighboring countries, and even if such agreements were made, they remain legally risky. But it also, I think, points us toward the fact that going tough is not necessarily a recipe for success. We need to remember here Jean-Marie Le Pen's infamous statement, voters prefer the original over the copy. And this actually brings me toward the third R, which is remember, namely remember the lessons learned. Given what we know about the AfD strategy in parliament, it is very, very, very unlikely that no matter what the new government will do on migration, that it will ever be enough for the AfD. So this type of criticism will not go away. And indeed, we also are kind of, it's part of this kind of wider toolkit that the AfD has been using that has been described as disruptive, that previous research, including co-authored work that I was involved in, kind of, described as basically a provoking and retreating kind of strategy, breaking social norms by decontextualizing previous, like the past history, particular events, and using basically procedures to undermine or question the legitimacy of the democratic and parliamentary process. It's also important to remember actually the failure of accommodation. So this is kind of when we think about responses of the new government to migration-related concerns, we need to remember that kind of Merz has been kind of has moved the CDU quite clearly to the right on these issues without stopping the rise of the AfD. And indeed, we know from social science comparative research that accommodating far-right positions on migration is not a vote winner, rather, like the evidence points to the contrary. And so potentially when thinking about how to engage with an emboldened far-right in parliament, but also how to respond to migration-related grievances, the parties might be well advised to remember their own record of party reform, because it's not the first time that particularly the Christian Democrats face a far-right challenger. Now we need to kind of, maybe they are kind of, it's worth remembering the 1950s, where the CDU actually kind of faced a number of right-wing and far-right challengers, and previous scholars have looked at these episodes, including Sarah Vigliati's fantastic book, but also my recent work, which actually shows that it's good to remember that to weather that storm, to weather that criticism is not, kind of copying the challenger has usually not been a successful strategy. Instead, what worked for the CDU in the 50s was to clearly demarcate themselves from extremist challengers while responding to voter grievances in a way that was credible, given the party's own brand, and then reaching out to more moderate forces in the challenger parties and offering opportunities for switching sides. So to some extent, I think remembering, in addition to reviving and responding, are kind of three of the challenges the new coalition is likely to face. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Matthias. I think I have lots of questions about things we could come back to. Nicolai, why don't you tell us what you think is going to be going on outside the German borders?
Yeah, thank you very much. Also, thank you for having me. Unfortunately, I don't have a fancy PowerPoint presentation, but I will, nor do I have a fancy alliteration, but I will still try to illustrate my 5 points that I brought with me. The first is what I would call a paradox about the importance of foreign policy for this election, and where the election basically started on an eventful foreign policy day. The previous coalition broke down on November the 5th. So on the very day the world found out that Donald Trump was re-elected, the German coalition decided after months and months of infighting that this was enough, and the FDP was thrown out of the government, as Louise previously explained. So early on the start, the German parties decided, okay, it's not important enough that we need a capable of acting German government in this phase, but rather have a long-term new election phase right when Donald Trump was elected in the US. And over the course of this election, we stretched it all the way to the first month of Donald Trump in office, foreign policy was almost no topic at all in this election. There was almost no discussion on how to handle Russia and Ukraine, very little discussion on how to handle Trump, very little discussion on the future German defense budget. But the number one topic, as Matthias already alluded to, was certainly migration. Also driven by the several atrocious attacks that we had in Germany. There was some discussions about economic competitiveness, but almost no discussion on foreign policy. And then on election night, right after the polls closed, Friedrich Merz said on public television in Germany, everything has changed. We can no longer trust the Americans. Europe needs to be able to defend itself, and Germany needs to invest massively in defense. And the following week, we had the, let's say, fallout between Zelensky and Trump in the Oval Office. And suddenly the dominating driving force of the new government was the changing geopolitical context and was the reason, at least publicly given by Friedrich Merz, that A, the government formation needed to be much quicker than usually, so 2.5 months is quick for German standards, even if it seems quite slow from a UK perspective. And secondly, that they made this historic decision even before the government was formed to create not only the 500 billion special investment fund for infrastructure and climate, but also to completely exempt defense from the debt brake, therefore changing one of the sort of pivotal election promises by the Conservative Party, that of no fundamental big new debt and no revision of the debt brake. And I just want to sort of put this at the beginning of this conversation, that we had this weird phase where the parties, and especially the mainstream parties, made the choice to almost completely sort of rule out talk about foreign and security policy during the election campaign, but right after the election campaign said this is the most important challenge facing Germany. And I think this is quite critical also for understanding some of the effects that these decisions have had on the German public debate. Secondly, as I already started to explain, the first major decision about Germany's future foreign and security policy, and therefore also for European security, was taken before the government was actually in place by that 500 billion investment fund and the exemption of defense spending from the debt brake. We do not know yet how huge the increase will be of the German defense budget. So there is, even in the coalition treaty, no explicit figure given in terms of percentage of GDP, but it's set to substantially increase over already the increases that we saw in previous years. Germany has just reached not only the 2% of NATO, but the latest SIPRI figures say that Germany is now the 4th biggest defense spender in the world, right after the US, China, and Russia. So already the biggest European spender, and it's set to even become bigger in terms of defense spending, and therefore much more important for European defense, right as we're facing the threat from Russia. And this is my third point. The coalition treaty has a very different threat perception. It starts off by clearly saying that Russia is the biggest and major threat to Germany and its allies, a very different language to the coalition treaty 3 years ago, of course reflecting the changes that we have seen over Ukraine. But I think it's important to keep that starting point for the changes of German foreign and security policy in mind, that there's a clear acceptance of Russia as a main security threat, a clear acceptance that Europeans need to do more for their own security, even though the coalition treaty is a little bit softer in the language on the United States than Merz was on election eve. It certainly doesn't say outright that the US is no longer a trustworthy ally, but says that Europeans, including Germany, need to do more for their foreign and security policy and their defense. And this is the starting point for all the further decisions that Germany and this government wants to take on foreign and security affairs. Which brings me to my fourth point, giving sort of this stark statement of this direct and acute and present danger from Russia. The coalition treaty doesn't read that ambitious. Both on foreign and security policy, but also on European affairs, I would characterize it more by ambitious pragmatism. So previous German coalition treaties often had grand visions. So the last coalition spoke about a European federal state. Previous grand coalition spoke of the desire to create a European army. And you will find none of these grand ideas on foreign and security policy nor on European policy in this new coalition treaty. But you will also find very few red lines. So I think there was a conscious decision by the governing parties to give the new government as much flexibility in European and foreign and security affairs as possible. in a sense, they learned from the last government, who was completely overtaken by events. As Louise said in the beginning, the Ukraine war started just a few months after the coalition treaty was signed. And given that these days events from the US can change on a daily basis, there was really the decision, okay, let's give this government as much flexibility as they can. Very little red lines, not on the EU budget, not on defense spending, not on where the priorities will lie between NATO, European defense, multilateral cooperation, and rather give a strong mandate for leadership. And this is the pre-final point. There is a strong leadership ambition by Friedrich Merz, who stressed it at every point that, how does he phrase it, Germany is back. A strong criticism of the previous government of having lost a leadership position in Europe and in the world. And so he wants to bring back Germany into a leadership position, both in wider European security and within the EU. And for that, he wants to build on partnerships, both in terms of countries. So there's the idea to very strongly build on Weimar Plus. So Germany, France, and Poland as the three core powers within the EU. Then in addition, Italy and Spain as the two other large European countries, plus the United Kingdom outside of the European Union. So very much building upon these large states for cooperation, and also for building a balancing power to the United States and the Trump administration. And the second partnership that he wants to build up is the European People's Party, which is currently the strongest party in the EU, very strong in the European Council, in the European Parliament, and of course also with Commission President Ursula von der Leyen. So he really wants to revive some of that old Merkelian power brokering of Germany in the European Union by building upon these alliances. And my final point is that as part of these alliance, he also wants to increase cooperation with the United Kingdom. In the coalition treaty, there's a clear ambition to sign a so-called friendship agreement with the UK. This is something the old German government already worked upon and actually planned to sign either in December or January this year. But then as the German government collapsed, the negotiations were stopped. But as far as we know, the negotiations were very far advanced. And these want to be picked up by the new government. And I would expect Friedrich Merz, who first wants to travel next week to Paris, Warsaw, and Brussels, to very soon also travel to London and continue this work on a UK-Germany friendship treaty to also deepen the bilateral cooperation between our two countries.
Thank you very much, Nicolai. And thanks, I see questions are starting to come in the Q&A box, so that's great. I think before we open it up to audience participation, I'd say a few more things about what's in the coalition agreement that maybe we haven't touched on yet. And then I have some questions trying to bring some of the two of your comments together. The first thing I'd say, there's additional things that are in this coalition agreement that are kind of interesting. There's definitely a focus on investing in research and innovation, especially in the aerospace area. There's a goal to put a German on the moon in this coalition. There's also, if we think about not only education at the kind of like corporate or R&D level, but also investment in education as well is important to this coalition. They're talking about investing in early childhood education, especially language acquisition for migrants, improving the Erasmus program, and in doing other research in other R&D type fields. There's also a surprising commitment to the environment, given that it's a red-black coalition and not a green coalition. An important focus we talked about on digitization, and trying to use digital tools to reduce bureaucracy. I guess one of Lars Klingbeil's pet things is to try to get rid of the fax machines that Germany uses to run, and trying to come up with some more modern technologies. If we look at issues that are close to my heart, questions on gender and sexuality, we can see that this election reduced the number of women in the Bundestag as it shifted to the right. It does not look like this is going to be a parity parity cabinet unless the SPD really puts a lot of women into their allocated spots. There's not a lot of discussion about gender or sexuality related issues in this coalition agreement at all, especially when we compare it to the previous one. Although there are some promises to improve contraceptive access for women, improve mental health services, improve funding for parents, especially dads, to stay at home or get tax breaks for providing care. So there are some nods in that direction. But I'd like to go back to something that both of you talked about, and I agree that I went with a delegation sponsored by the International Association for the Study of German Politics to observe the German election campaign and the runoff to the election. And we met with officials from all sorts of different parties and different think tanks within Germany, and all of them were very clear that it was a deliberate strategy on the part of most of the mainstream parties not to discuss foreign and security policy or the cost of defense, because they didn't think that it would be a winning issue. They thought that it would give ammunition to the far left or the far right and some more pacifist elements in German society. So it was really a deliberate decision not to talk about basically the cost of defending Germany against a hostile East and an unreliable West. And then, of course, as was talked about, the night of the election, all of a sudden that changed, and literally within, an hour's worth of time, it switched to we really have to, be able to defend ourselves. And then if we talk about this decision to vote on the special fund and to exempt defense spending from the debt brake, that was also not an accident that the decision was reached prior to the sitting of the new parliament, right? That was a deliberate decision that was made because there was strong suspicion that with the strength of the AfD and the strength of the left party in the new parliament, that measure wouldn't have gotten the required majority. And so even though an election had been held, the old parliament took this really, I think, forward-looking step strategically so that it would pass against the opposition of maybe of groups that had actually gained vote shares during the election. So on the one hand, all this happened. On the other hand, if we look at opinion polls, the ratings of the CDU are declining, and the AfD's approval rating has been going up. And in fact, if an election were held today, the coalition would not receive a majority in the polls. And I wondered if either one of you would like to talk about how you think that decision not to talk about security and that decision to kind of rush through security measures before the parliament takes shape, what's going to be the long-term ramifications of making decisions like that, either domestically or internationally?
Yeah, I can start. So I think there's a couple of interesting points about that. The first is there has been some polls on how Germans receive that decisions on the debt brake and exempting defense from that, and they were quite clear. They were saying a majority of Germans approve of that decision, and also a majority of Germans said that Merz misled them. And so I think that's quite interesting and also quite rational of Germans to say, okay, this is the right decision, but it was not right to not speak about that during the election campaign. And I think it's an overall part of, from my point of view, a mistake the CDU made during the election campaign, that they behaved in the election campaign like an opposition party and not a government in waiting. And so they made lots of promises that they would know that they could not keep after the election. And especially they fought the election primarily against the center left, while knowing that this was their only possible coalition partner. Even on election eve on Saturday, Merz made a speech in Munich, very critical of all these lefties and very critical of working with the left, knowing full well that on election night he would need to work with either the SPD or the SPD and the Greens, having completely ruled out any kind of coalition or even talks with the AfD. And so I think this for me is a bigger strategic mistake, promising sort of a complete turn of politics towards the right when he knew that he would need to compromise on the center. And I think this is the reason, or part of the reason, why Germans are so impatient with this government. And this would be my second answer to your question. I think it shows the very short patience span of publics in this very quick age of accelerated politics, where usually governments have at least 100 days to show what they can implement. And now it's even before the government is actually in place, the trust in the public has dropped down so significant. And this is, of course, quite dangerous. Many in the CDU, CSU speak about this being a government of last chance. So the last chance to convince the German public not to vote for far-right extremists into government in Germany. And you can sense in Berlin already the nervousness within the CDU-CSU rising. And even though they are not even yet in office, they're already staring at these opinion polls where the AfD in some of them is already above the CDU-CSU. And this makes for a very nervous government. I think initially it has contributed to this risk-taking willingness of Merz, including what you said, this willingness to take the risk to make this decision on the debt brake in the old Bundestag, even though everybody knows it was a little bit of a dirty procedural trick. They knew this was a trick that was legally acceptable and admissible, and therefore their best chance to take that decision quickly. And I think this pressure will at least initially drive the CDU, CSU and the SPD to take more far-reaching decisions. But if this polling continues, then this perception of being the government of last chance might also paralyze the government. We will see, but this is certainly the overarching feeling that I get the sense from this government that they are already under heat even the days before the Chancellor is already elected.
Thank you. Matthias?
Yeah, I think there are like elements that I agree with Nicolai, and elements where my perspective might be slightly different. I agree that I agree that the Christian Democrats are paying the price for strategic mistakes made during the election campaign. I think that's true. It's interesting that Nicolai, that you kind of framed it as like, they were primarily campaigning against the center left. For me, the kind of looking at the election campaign, the entire focus was on pandering to the right, right? Like, was kind of the entire kind of the emphasis was very much on playing tough on, kind of being tough on migration, kind of appealing to that AfD vote, which for me as a political scientist is always is very frustrating, because we know that this is not a winning strategy. There are a few things that we know for certain in like the social sciences, but the empirical evidence that accommodation is not a vote-winning strategy is overwhelming. And so it was not surprising that it wasn't the vote winner, but of course it failed as an election strategy. And actually, and it complicated subsequent coalition negotiations. So I think in that sense, I agree that they're currently paying the price for strategic mistakes during the election campaign. I think it's obviously kind of a timing question, right? Like, from when we kind of consider, where we know that incoming governments have usually kind of a honeymoon period, right? Kind of the 100-day mark, etc. Kind of is usually kind of very important or symbolic in that sense. It's always a question when this starts, right? So the new government hasn't been fully announced yet, hasn't been kind of voted in yet, like, right? So I think it's interesting that you kind of mentioned the nervousness within the CDU. I think my response to that would be to kind of, as often in life, kind of calming down a little bit and thinking up, and taking step by step is probably a good strategy. And I think on the special sessions as well. And I think the incoming government needs to be careful how to pick up and respond to certain narratives that are being put forward, because of course when the special sessions where of the Bundestag were announced, of course there was the criticism from the AfD very loudly that this would not be legitimate. This is a narrative that is not grounded in the basic law. I mean, kind of the basic law allows for these special sessions to take place. It's true that it's unusual for outgoing kind of parliaments to make such forward-looking perspectives, but there's a reason why the basic law allows for it. And obviously these are very different and very kind of challenging times. And I think it is one of those examples where the obviously kind of, from the opposition side, but also especially from the AfD, there's an incentive to frame this as a legitimacy question. It doesn't have to be framed and discussed in that way. And I think it's also like a reminder for the incoming government to think about not only responding to narratives, but thinking whether actually the premise on which these narratives are sometimes based are promising or indeed correct.
Thank you, Matthias. We also had a notification in the chat that our sound level had dropped, so I'm going to try to continue speaking loudly, and I hope this comes through. I want to pick up on what you just said. You referred to these as challenging times, and we talked about some of those challenges, right? We talked about Putin and trying to stem the threat from the east. We've talked about at least at best the unreliable nature of the transatlantic relationship at this time. The other thing that I want to pick up on and talk about here is that third of the top 3 military spenders, and that is China. I think Germany has not really had a clear China policy in the past. I think we can see kind of 2 strands here where there's a desire to promote democracy and human rights, but there's also a desire for trade and positive economic relationships. And I think also we need to think going forward also about strategic types of considerations. And I wonder if either of you had thoughts about how the relationship of China is likely to play out under this new government. The coalition agreement, I think, doesn't give us a lot to work on or work with, other than also a promise to try to engage China and develop ties with Taiwan, which I think kind of highlights where Germany is in this relationship. But would either of you want to weigh in on the China question?
I can say a couple of words, but it basically boils down to what you just said, that we don't know yet. It's certainly that Friedrich Merz has been more hawkish on China than previous CDU leaders, certainly than Merkel was. We had, I didn't mention it before, we had one significant foreign policy intervention during the campaign, which didn't get a lot of attention in Germany, but at least was interesting, which was sort of statement-like speech of Friedrich Merz on his foreign policy vision at the Körber Foundation. And there he not only singled out Russia as a main threat, but also promised a more hawkish stance on China. But in the coalition treaty, as you said, it says de-risking should be a primary sort of target of the approach, but then goes with the old trifecta of China as a partner, competitor, and systemic rival. I think, or my sense is that there are two trends battling against each other. And the first is that certainly Friedrich Merz and the new foreign minister Wadefuhl are more hawkish on China. They perceive China as a direct competitor also for the German automotive industry and want Germany and the EU to be more robust with China and speak with China sort of from a position of strength. However, given the not only unreliability of the US as an ally, but the Trump tariffs on Europe, the question of German competitiveness and economic growth, there is some, at least, conversations in Berlin whether we should not look again at China as a potential trading partner, try to increase European trade with China. So I think these strands are still, in a sense, battling each other out, and there has not been, at least to the outside world, a clearly communicated change of stance towards China. And so for now, I would see just the only gradual shift to a little bit more, at least on a rhetorical level, hawkish position without yet sort of a clear opposing position that we have seen. Maybe one final point. There is certainly a fear of trade divergence so of trade from China being diverged from the United States to Europe, and the European and German market being flooded by cheap Chinese goods. And I think this is something where the German government would at least encourage the European Commission to look at it very closely and respond to it accordingly, especially when it would threaten the German car industry.
Thank you. Matthias, did you want to say something about China? Okay, then I'm going to ask one final question before we open it up to the Q&A. And that is, if we look at Germany's post-war history, generally Germany has stable governments. They last all 4 years. In 2021, when I read through the Ampel coalition's coalition agreement, I questioned whether the coalition would last all 4 years. I have to say people laughed at me, but I turned out to be right. And so I don't want to weigh in now because I'm not really sure, but I'm interested in your opinions. Is this a government that's going to be able to last all 4 years? I think there's some things that might indicate that it will, not least, Nicolai, what you were talking about in terms of having an agreement that allows for flexibility, allows for events to be taken into consideration. But on the other hand, these are also parties that have tried to work together for a really long time, and maybe they're running out of things where they can find overlap. So Matthias or Nicolai, do you have a guess about what's going to happen for the next 4 years?
I mean, it's like this is usually the moment when I hope I had a crystal ball. So it's of course like very hard to predict with certainty. But as Nicolai has just said, right, there are no incentives for either of the kind of 3 parties involved in the new government, CDU, CSU, and SPD, to go to the polls anytime in the near future. And indeed, I think if we think about kind of the record of kind of so-called grand coalitions or like black-red coalitions, probably not so grand in terms of like number of seats or share of seats anymore. It's been, I mean, we haven't had like kind of them that frequently kind of to derive patterns, but I think at least kind of the common observation might be that there's often been some noise at the start, but then kind of it tended to kind of work quite well. Both parties, of course, like both CDU, CSU, but also SPD have also, I think, kind of the somehow kind of the self-perception of being parties of government, of being parties that ensure political stability in Germany. So I think they are policy disagreements, of course, coexist quite fundamentally, although like the coalition agreement suggests that important compromises might have been reached. But I think there are good reasons to expect this government to last, as is the norm in German politics as well.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, they certainly are parties of government if we look at their track records. Nicolai, any thoughts?
Yeah, I don't know whether I have a better crystal ball, but would maybe add a couple of thoughts. First, so the 2 previous CDU Chancellor, Helmut Kohl and Angela Merkel, both lasted 16 years, 4 terms each. And I would be highly surprised if Merz sort of matches that feat. And if we get another 16 years of the same Chancellor, German politics certainly has become more volatile. I'm also leaning towards seeing those as governments or parties of government and parties of responsibility. You mentioned, Louise, in the beginning, today's announcement of the SPD membership vote, which voted over 80% for the coalition treaty in a time where they really didn't sort of wanted to work with the CDU. And I think it shows that also the membership realized that this is a chance that needs to be taken. So I think it would need to take immense events to break this coalition apart. So I would also tend towards seeing it to last for 4 years. However, I think there's one issue that could really drive a wedge through them, and this is the relationship to the AfD. And the so-called Brandmauer, which for now the CDU not only keeps on the national level, but at all levels down to the very regional level. And there's very strong pressure on that on the eastern part of Germany for the CDU there to start working with the AfD. And even on the national level, there are parts of the CDU which speak about at least normalization of relationship to the AfD, treating them as a normal opposition party in the Bundestag, which would give them some committee chairs, some roles in foundations, in other areas of public life. And I think if we see a further rightward shift of conservative parties around Europe, and the CDU at some point in this legislative period makes the choice to break down the Brandmauer, the firewall, and starts working together with the AfD, for instance, in a regional parliament in Germany, I think this would be the most critical point for this government, and I think is the highest pressure point from a point of view of internal politics facing this government, and the AfD knows that. They know that they have this mathematical majority with the CDU, CSU in the Bundestag, and they will try to probe this coalition at every point, making proposals in the Bundestag that they think the CDU will vote in favor, but the SPD will not. And so I think this will be the biggest test of the coalition cohesion for these 4 years.
I can just like kind of very quickly come in there because I agree the relationship with the AfD or the response toward the AfD will be crucial. And here actually it might be worth for the CDU to remember that the CDU that the C in both CDU and CSU doesn't stand for conservative, as we might sometimes like be tempted to translate, but for Christian democratic. And actually kind of if I look at the kind of the names that Merz has, or that the CDU has published, or CDU, CSU have published with regard to kind of the next ministers and the next cabinet members, it strikes me that the CDU has not yet returned to kind of a practice that actually kind of used to make it very successful, namely kind of factional integration, integrating kind of incorporating the different kind of wings, kind of a more social Catholic, labor-oriented wing, a more kind of liberal, kind of often urban wing, and a more kind of socially conservative wing, and so. Let's see, kind of Merz's strategy has been to kind of move the party to the right, and I kind of miss the big names for those other streams or these other factions within the party in the new cabinet, and that if that's an indication of like his future plans, then it might become kind of quite complicated when it comes kind of to responding to that pressure, withholding that pressure toward normalization with the AfD.
Because I think that really, I mean, that's the relationship with the AfD also determines what your other coalitional possibilities are, right? So this is I'm going to turn it over now to the audience, and we have that's a nice segue into a question that was asked by Mark Cassell here in the chat. I'm just going to read it aloud, and then whoever wants to take it is welcome to take it. He says, I wonder about the CSU. Söder is clearly far more charismatic than Klingbeil and Merz. Spahn has called for normalizing relations with the AfD. If the CDU begins to build close relations with the AfD, how will the CSU behave? The CSU's economic policies look like Biden's industrial policy. If the CDU Spahn moves to the right, would the CSU and Söder consider moving left, maybe even breaking with its sister party? As an aside, Alexander Dobrindt has made positive statements about the Greens, and Söder and Esken are on a first-name basis.
Happy to go first on this one. Thank you, Mark, for this question. So I think there are two elements to the question, right? So kind of one, would the CSU kind of consider moving to the left, and the second kind of even breaking with its sister party. Like, let me kind of take the second first. I don't see that happening, to be honest. I mean, the CDU CSU have kind of formed a joint parliamentary group since 1949. They were apart from, I think it was like maybe, I don't quite remember, like maybe 6 or 7 weeks in the early 70s when there were discussions around forming separate parliamentary groups. This has never been seriously questioned, and it doesn't strike me from an electoral perspective as a very smart, kind of as a very smart move. In terms of the CSU's kind of positions, it's interesting that you kind of framed it in that way. I think it shows to some extent the the flexibility that the CSU kind of, followed in its kind of, general outlook in recent years, right? We need to remember, like, when it came to the kind of, in the run-up to the 2021 election, Söder initially kind of presented himself as, or kind of, we had both periods where kind of Söder presented himself as kind of a climate and kind of, environmentalist candidate, kind of more kind of, appealing more to kind of, greenish or greener voters. Then kind of turning like, kind of away from that, kind of embracing kind of a more migration critical perspective. So I think to some extent we've seen a lot of flexibility with regard to kind of the CSU's positioning. Whether this goes against the CDU's orientation, I think there are kind of natural limits to that. I would kind of expect such differences to play out more when it comes to leadership elections, but not necessarily kind of when it comes to kind of the working of the coalition.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's actually an interesting question that I had never really thought about before. And I guess if they split them, theoretically, the CDU could start to campaign in Bavaria too. So then you'd have two parties competing there. Let's switch gears a little bit. I have a question in the chat from Francis Lancaster that says, given Germany's failure up to now to spend its promised level of GDP on defense, what confidence is there that it will now? President Trump wanted European countries to spend 2% of GDP, and few do. So isn't all this talk about the US being an unreliable ally just a cover for this failure when Trump is right? And to add to that, I guess my question, phrasing this in another way, Olaf Scholz promises a Zeitenwende, but he didn't deliver. Is this government going to get us a Zeitenwende?
So maybe I can start with this one. I would push back a little bit. So certainly Trump, one, has been right on the failure of Europeans to spend enough on defense. And maybe Europeans needed the shock, electroshock, like Macron has said, from the US to spend more on defense. But it's no longer true that this is the case. So I think the latest numbers was last year, 23 of NATO allies hit the 2%, including Germany, for the first time in a long while. As I said, it is now far eclipsing France and the UK in terms of defense spending. So it has hit the 2%. And I think it's clear that for the new government, the 2% is no longer the ceiling, but the floor of defense spending. So I would expect it to go significantly above 2% in the next years. That being said, that still means that Europeans have a lot to catch up in terms of military capabilities. And the threat by Russia is real. There's some interesting calculation that in terms of purchasing power parity, Russia is actually outspending the whole of the European Union in its defense spending. So clearly what Germany and other European countries, including the UK, is doing is not enough. But I would at least push back a little bit that countries have not met their target at all. The question is sort of moving forward. Certainly, I would expect the government to now spend significantly more than 2% on its defense spending. But I think the task is bigger than that. In terms of just the numbers, you could argue that Scholz was successful at the end. He hit the 2%. But what he really wasn't able to do is change the mindset of Germans on being willing to invest in security and defense, on being willing to support the armed forces, and on thinking about the option of really sort of strengthening allies on the Eastern Front. And I think this is something that Friedrich Merz will have to do, and will have to convince Germans, like we discussed earlier, that this additional spending on defense also is to the benefit of the security of Germans, and not this far away place. And I think, secondly, what he will have to do is that it's not just enough, like many other European countries, including the UK, found out, it's not just enough to throw more money at the problem. You need to also change procurement laws. You need to do more European joint procurement. You need to reform the European defense industry with a strong German defense industry as part of that. And I think this is an area where also UK-Germany cooperation can be quite fruitful. We've seen this Trinity House agreement last year of Germany and the UK cooperating on defense. And recently, Germany was the co-leader of the Rammstein platform for supporting Ukraine militarily together with the United States. And recently, the United States dropped out of that leadership role and the UK took over. So Germany and the UK are now the co-leaders of that platform. And I think these are the kind of things that Europeans will need to do, not just investing more in defense, but also taking more responsibility for command and control, for supporting Ukraine, and to get these strategic enablers that are necessary for deterrence.
Yeah, thank you very much, Nicolai. Yeah, I would agree. It's not just how much you spend, but what are you spending it on and how effectively is the money being spent. We have one last question in the chat. Oh, I now see you have two more questions in the chat, but I'll do this next one and then we'll see if we have time for the next. Joyce Mushaven writes, regarding the durability of the coalition, Angela Merkel had many orientations that overlap with the SPD and the Greens, allowing her three grand coalitions to survive. Merz has suggested that he wishes to refute many Merkel policies. So doesn't it make a difference to who is Chancellor and that person's ability to collaborate with the other party?
I'd love to answer to that, and I can be very brief. Yes, I fully agree. I'm very thank you for raising the point. I think it's a very important point. And indeed, there have been reservations or questions around Merz's ability to broker kind of agreements, to kind of bring people together. There has certainly been this reservation, and I completely agree with Professor Mushaven's point. People do matter in politics. What I would probably what has been in that sense encouraging, if we think about when it comes to the durability or prospective durability of the coalition, is that the coalition agreement has been agreed on quite quickly for German standards, given especially the campaign that we previously saw in Merz seems to have switched gear a little bit in terms of how he's communicating. But of course, the comment is absolutely right. It will a lot depend on his ability to bring people together, continue to bring people together.
Can I add on that, or maybe speak a little bit against that? I think yes, Merz has a different character than Merkel. But in hindsight, many people in Germany view the Merkel years now a little bit more critically. She certainly presided over these grand coalitions, but she also was very risk averse, very rarely doing big visions, major reforms. And I think Merz is more willing to take the risk. And maybe this is something that Germany needs more. And where there is an overlap between the CDU and the SPD is certainly on economic competitiveness and reforming the German economy. And so I think Merkel always had this this mantra of die Dinge vom Ende her denken, to think through things from the end. So always very cautiously looking at what others were doing, only making proposals when she saw a majority for something, and always avoiding to upset the public a lot. And I think Merz is the opposite from that. He is sometimes impulsive, which can be difficult for him politically, but he's also willing to take more risk. And this might be something that that German politics needs at the moment, rather than another Merkel character, which tries to avoid large-scale reforms as much as possible.
Well, that's a great segue into one of the questions in the chat that's been asked. There's two more. I'm going to combine them because we are basically out of time, but I'm just going to indulge us in the luxury of looking at these two questions. Paul Lever writes, Merz has hinted that given Trump's clear disinclination to defend Europe, the issue of nuclear deterrence may need to be revisited. Are there any circumstances in which Germany itself could feel obligated to go nuclear? Are dual key arrangements with the UK or France feasible? So that would certainly be a big move. That was different than what we've seen in past decades. And then Vanessa Schoen writes a question, what has been each party's main sacrifice in order to reach agreement? Which I think is a really interesting question. So I'll put the two questions together. Those will be our last questions, and then we'll wrap up. So do we have a volunteer to go first? Matthias? Oh, are you just
okay? He's volunteering me to go first. So perfect. Thinking about them, the first question on nuclear deterrence, it's certainly something that's being raised in the German debate. Merz has said that he's willing to talk with Macron's offer for some kind of cooperation for nuclear deterrence. But Macron has also been very clear that the final decision will always rest with the French president. And given the quite big uncertainties about who the next French president is, this is not much more reliable than the United States. And if I perceive these discussions in Berlin, I think there will be a lot of investments on conventional deterrence and a lot of hope that the nuclear questions will not need to be asked. And that it's not Germany who will hand in the divorce paper to the Americans. So the only option where I could see that happening is if the US really sort of massively pulls out troops from Europe and makes it even more clear you are on your own now, rather than the situation of uncertainty that we have for the moment, which I think are not enough to compel such a major step by this German government, which I think will try to focus more on the conventional deterrence and trying to offer the Americans some kind of burden sharing where the Europeans take over this conventional deterrence much more, but leave the nuclear deterrence to the Americans. On the second part, on what the parties sacrifice, so the CDU, CSU certainly made that big sacrifice on the debt brake, on some of the social policies. They even made some concessions to the Greens to get that 2/3 majority in the old Bundestag on climate policies. So the overall policy shift is less transformational and radical than the CDU promised in its election campaign. But I think the SPD certainly accepted most of the ideas of the CDU on migration and to give them the lead on migration, but also on economic competitiveness, where I think the overlap by the two parties was the largest. But I think really the biggest concessions I would name is CDU debt brake and SPD on migration.
Matthias.
Actually, very little or nothing to add. I think one on the sacrifices, it might prove rather than kind of being the burden as which it was previously discussed, it might actually prove quite helpful for the CDU-CSU, that kind of the sacrifice on the debt brake has been made before the new government is coming, and it's not one of those plans that needs to be implemented anymore because it has been posted.
Nicolai, did you have another thing to say?
Can I have one last thought, which I think might be important? I think one of the sacrifices the SPD made was giving Euro policy to the CDU, because this is the first time that the CDU in a long time has gotten the foreign ministry, and now actually the Chancellery, the foreign ministry, and the economy ministry, so all the three major ministries who design Euro policy are all in CDU hands. And this might be also an important sacrifice in our conversation, that really foreign and Euro policy is under the control of the CDU now.
Well, thanks you both for talking. I see Tamara has arrived on our screen, which is probably like the cutoff for our session. Thank you all attendees who came. It was great to see so many familiar faces and such a good turnout. So Tamara, I'll turn it over to you now.
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you so much for these insights that you shared with us. It was a very fascinating discussion, and thank you also to everyone at home for joining us. And we have a couple of in-person events coming up in London, but our next online event is on e-mobility, which will be in July, and I hope to see some of you there. Thank you again and have a lovely evening.